Lord Bilimoria, Naushad, welcome to JLF. Uh, we were wondering whether road closures today was going to get the better of you. You're going to disappear before we started the session, but thank you for coming. I'm going to start by asking both of you, what is it about these Parsis? How is it that you all are so successful?
Thank you so much, Sanjoy, and great to be here in this wonderful weather at the British Library and with the Jaipur Literary Festival. Sanjoy, great to see you as always, and Naushad, my great friend, who's just written this wonderful book. What is it about this tiny community of just 100,000 of us in the world? I mean, we are the smallest minority community in the world. There's no question about it. And I'm actually embarking on some research later this year, which will take me a few years, to look into why is this little community so successful in every field. I mean, if you think about it, whether there's doctors and lawyers and business people, the armed forces, everything, sports, Farouk engineer, Queen, Freddie Mercury, you name it, the Parsis have excelled. And they've excelled for centuries, pre-independence and post-independence. So it's going to make some very interesting studies.
So is it because you all were migrants and sort of thrown out of one country and had to find a way to be able to adopt into another country?
Well, migrants actually are always overrepresented, generally in entrepreneurship. It's true pretty well around the world, and it's true across communities. I think for the Parsis, we're such a small community. There's this thing that if we drop by another 30,000 in total population, we become officially, under the Indian norms, a tribe, not a religion. And when we cross, when we get below 50,000. But if you look at overrepresentation, we're always overrepresented. Because if you have one Parsi, whether in industry or in law or in academia, given the number of the total community, we're overrepresented for our numbers. And I think that one of the things that's a strength is that we cross different fields. We're not stuck in any particular field. There are lots of successful industrialists, there are lots of successful professionals, lawyers and doctors and so on. And we don't tend to be so much of a network, right? I mean, I don't think Parsis necessarily help other Parsis get ahead, except in schools and education, maybe.
Well, this is part of my study is going to be all these issues. Is there nepotism? Is there a network effect? Is it the culture? Is it the religion? Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. In Parliament, the first three, ethnic minority, Indian, parliamentarians in Westminster, going back to 1892, all three were Parsis.
Starting with Dadabhai Naoroji, right?
Dadabhai Naoroji, 1892, Liberal. 1895, Samanchuji Bhanu, Greek Conservative. 1922, Shapoorji Saklatwala, Labour, with Communist and Labour. Now just look at that, three different parties. I'm the first Parsi in the House of Lords, and I'm an independent crossbench peer. So only the Parsis can do that and square that circle. But again, even in politics over here in this country,
they say that there's the question, how many Parsis does it take to have an argument? And the answer is one, because we use a mirror. But
Naushad, going back to the question of networks, Ashish Nandi sort of argues that much of, at least in India and certainly in the rest of the world, business communities have been able to be successful because of the networks that they have been established in, whether it's in the case of India, public school, or in the case of the UK, private schooling, universities like Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or wherever, where you then create another lot of networks. And then, of course, the economic and caste network that we all at some level belong to. How do you see that playing out? And has that been one of the stories that you are now seeing changing with the advent of technology?
So I'm not sure how powerful network effects have been in the success of Parsis and Parsi enterprise particularly.
I'm talking now in general. Let's move beyond
But what I think has been successful is that Parsis tend to have developed over time a certain reputation, and a reputation, I think, for doing business somewhat better, for being somewhat more ethical. And there are lots of exceptions to the contrary, but by and large being more ethical, being more principled in how they go about doing things, in investing in education. And I think that reputation has been extremely helpful. in that people like doing business with Parsis because there's some inherent level of trust. I think that reputation effect is very, very powerful and important. I hope you look at it, Karan.
No, very much so. The whole aspect of trust. And even if we're talking about whatever we talk about in life, that aspect of trust. And one of my Harvard Business School professors in the pandemic gave a 1-hour lecture online, a virtual lecture on trust. And I'll sum up a 1-hour lecture in 1 minute. And she said trust is a triangle. To get trust from people, you've got to be authentic. You've got to have the logic. You've got to have the capability and the knowledge to deliver what you're promising to deliver. And third is you've got to have empathy. Are you in it for yourself or are you in it for them? And I think if you look at a community like the Parsis, there is that authenticity. We are authentic. We can laugh at ourselves. We have that logic and capability in every field. Most importantly, though, I think it is the empathy. I think that Mahatma Gandhi is saying Parsis in numbers beneath contempt, in contribution beyond compare. And it's that putting back in the community, not your own community, but the wider community, that is so important.
I'm going to come back to empathy as part of, building bricks for industry. But Karan, you talked about authentic knowledge and empathy. We last met when you came to FICCI, which is an industry body in India.
We won't mention.
You won't
FICCI.
mention. Naushad was the president of CII, which is the sort of new kid on the block, or was the new kid on the block. But you've just come back from India. Do you see a future there? Well, the UK is going to be signing the new trade agreement with India, if not now, pretty soon. What do you think that's going to do? Is it going to unlock any unrecognized potential, or are there still hurdles in the many meetings that you went to?
Yes, so Sanjoy, the first meeting when I was leading the first parliamentary delegation from the UK to India in 6 years. Now that says something. You can make an excuse about the pandemic for a couple of years, but I'm sorry, to not have had a delegation for 6 years, there's no excuse for that. There hasn't been a big prime ministerial delegation from the UK to India since Theresa May went there in November 2016.
And screwed it up with the whole visa thing.
And yes, that wasn't a particularly successful visit. But the ones before that, I've been with Tony Blair, with Gordon Brown, with David Cameron. We would literally take a jumbo jet full of cabinet ministers, business leaders, the press, university leaders. Made a huge impact. We haven't done that for many years. So this delegation was fantastic. But one of the messages starting from the meeting that you chaired was, the UK, you're not doing enough. You should be doing more. And the Americans are doing a huge one. I'm from Hyderabad. If you go to Hyderabad now, Hyderabad is buzzing. You look at the big American companies, Microsoft, Google, they've all got huge billion-dollar presences employing tens of thousands of people. Foxconn's just opened up a new facility there to make iPhones that's going to employ, you correct me, 100,000 people eventually. That is what's happening in India. It's saying, why aren't you the Brits over there? There are reforms that have taken place that I've been fighting for a long time. I founded the UK India Business Council. Foreign lawyers to practice in India. At long last now, foreign lawyers can practice in India. Not in courts, but they can practice, give advisory work. Foreign universities opening up in India. At long last now, foreign universities can open up in India. So these are big opportunities for Britain because services, we are the second largest services export in the world. Universities, we have I'm proud to say this, the best universities in the world along with America. 4 out of the top 10 in the QS rankings are British universities. 5 are American, 1 is Swiss. What's the population of America? 330 million. What's our population? 67 million. We have 4, they have 5. I think we do pretty well. And out of the top 100, we've got 17, including Birmingham, where I'm proud to be Chancellor. 17 out of 100 British universities, and we're less than 1% of the world's population. So we do really well. We've got a lot to offer. We've got to be doing much more with India, and India wants to do it. We want to. The FTA will help.
Naushad, Karan was talking about education as the sort of key to unlock it. And one of the things that has been happening in India is how do you make the universities in India among the top 100?
Yeah.
Some people argue that it's not by opening it up to international universities, but what do you need to do to increase good education through scientific inquiry and research and development within the universities? How do you see education playing a role, and what do we need to do, especially today where we are seeing education at the fault line, at the front line of the fault lines, where large sections of history are being rewritten. We're being told scientifically that we had, flying chariots 5,000 years ago. We may well have had, we don't know. But all of that, how do you see this sort of being working through?
I think three things. I always have three answers.
The
usually.
lucky number.
Yeah, so three things that we need to do. First, we should recognize how much has been achieved in the education system once it started being opened up, at least partially, for more professional education, sort of 40 years ago. In that, if you look at the proportion of the age group that goes through higher education in India now versus 40 years ago, the number's gone, if I remember correctly, it's gone from around 5% of the age group to around just under 30% now. And that under 30% now is, we have 35 million students in higher education at any point in time in the country. That's a pretty large number, and it's a system that is today overwhelmingly private, where 40 years ago it was overwhelmingly public. So that's the achievement. The bad bit that came out of that was that the quality suffered because the system expanded ahead of qualified faculty getting created. And we've been trying to deal with that quality problem in various ways. One of the key ways in which we've tried to deal with it is by trying to regulate quality into the system. That's been a miserable failure. The quality has stayed where it was. What has been more successful is that as demand for education, for higher education, has lessened below supply, because lots of private providers have come in, suppliers have started to see that the only way in which they can compete to get enough students to fill those spaces is through quality. And so the market, in a way, is actually delivering some improvements in quality finally. Yeah? So that's the second piece. So, that how do you deal with the quality problem? You deal with the quality problem by really letting institutes compete and freeing them up so that they can compete through a combination of competition and then autonomy, freedom to do what they need to. And then the third piece is where there's a very significant role for the state, which is the point you mentioned about investments in public research. In that we invest a fair amount, the Indian government invests a fair amount in public research, about the world average actually. The problem is not how much we invest, it's where we invest. We invest in autonomous government R&D laboratories instead of in the higher education system. If we made that single change of shifting the public research that we do from these autonomous government laboratories into the higher education system, you get the single big benefit of doing public research, which is the quality of talent you produce in the education system. And that quality of talent can then be quite transformative in innovation. It can be transformative in many walks of life. So I think those are the three things we really need to worry about.
Karan, to add to, you say what you have, but Naushad was talking about competition. Is there a level playing field in India where you can compete?
Yeah.
In education.
In education.
Yeah. So there's no question about it that the Indian education system has been improving and needs to improve hugely.
Much more. Yeah.
The foreign universities being able to open up is going to be a big advantage.
One part of the answer.
Partnerships. I'll come on to the research point, but I say before we look at India, look at over here. I was on the Times Education Commission. We reported last year. If you haven't seen it, see it's a very good report on the whole of education in this country, from cradle to grave, lifelong learning, primary school, secondary school, universities, colleges. Our private schools in this country make up 7% of our students. Children go to private schools, 93% go to state schools. The average spent on a child per year at state school is £5,000. The average spent in a private school, I'm not talking about boarding, I'm talking about day private school, like for like, is 15,000. So if we were to spend 3 times as much on each state school child, just the extra spending alone, can you imagine how much more that would deliver? And how much have we spent? In the past decade, our health spending has gone up multifold. Our education spending in a whole decade has gone up by 3%. So we underinvest. Our university fees are $9,250 for a domestic student. That's been fixed for years. In real terms, that's £6,000. Now, can you imagine Cobra Beer? If you suddenly tell me you've got to cut your price by 1/3 and you've got to deliver the same world-class beer and still make profits and still survive. That's what universities have to do now. Literally 1/3 less. So if you want to have excellent world-class education on the cheap, that's not the way to go about it. We've got to invest in education. I said, if I were Prime Minister, my number one priority would be investing in schools and in education. That's the most important thing by far.
You know, in our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, you had to come to the UK to complete your education. My brother did. I studied here in school. Today, everybody goes to America or Canada or Australia. UK is not necessarily anymore the sort of...
It is. It very much is. No.
Changing
UK is. Now, I chaired the all-party parliamentary group on international students. We got the government to set a target of 600,000 students, international. We're now at 690. And here's the good news. The Chinese are always the number one. Now the Indians are the number one and have overtaken the Chinese, 130,000 international students from India who come over here. And the 2-year post-graduation work visa was instrumental in attracting students to come here.
It's a very good scheme. This work visa, you know, where you get the 2-year period is actually a very
which is what they copied
thing
from the Americans before the Americans then shut it down, and now it's back here.
Yeah.
Naushad, you know, your book, and it's a brilliant book for anybody who wants to do business in India or anybody who's into innovation and technology. Do please read the book. It's The Struggle and the Promise. Now, we all know about the struggle. We all struggle in Bollywood, in the arts, in business. The promise, we keep hearing about the 10 trillion economy in India or the aspiration. So is it a promise or is it a mirage? And what do you see to be the promise?
Looks, you know, we are going to be a 10 trillion economy. It has to happen simply because of the number of people that we are, just the size of. So the question is not how soon, you know, the question is not whether we get to 5 trillion or 10 trillion as the current goals are. It's how soon do we get there. So what's our growth rate and what's our per capita GDP? Because that's what ultimately will determine whether or not we're an affluent, successful society. The promise actually comes from the very same thing that is also always a challenge in India. You know, when you divide by the number of people, anything in India is tough. Because if you look at doctors per person, if you look at even
mental health consultants,
anything, you know, it's the numbers shrink because when you're dividing by 1.4 billion, you end up with a small number. Yeah, but the promise is also the breadth of that talent, the diversity of that talent, and the fact that it excels in so many different fields and areas. And I'd say, and I'll add a fourth piece, which I think our current government doesn't appreciate enough, which is that we are largely a private sector driven economy. And private initiative makes all the difference in how our economy prospers. The same is true in the UK. I mean, you know, with apologies, I mean, you know, in the last few years, I mean, if the economy has done anything, it's done it in spite of, you know, a government that seemed to find it great joy in falling over its feet.
Falling over its wine glass. I don't know about the feet.
Yeah. So you know, but it's. I think it's. But in India, I think if we recognize that we're a private sector-driven economy, so therefore the role of the state is significant, but the role of the state is to enable, it's not to do. And what does it mean to enable? Is I think what we should be talking about, and you know, whether it's in education, or whether it's in research, or whether it's in innovation, or whether it's in what companies have to do, we shouldn't be saying, make this. We should be enabling companies to make the right decisions of what to make.
Current role of the state is to be an enabler. You have today China, which is a strong state, which started off as a communist state, but then decided that it needed to move forward, and it did very, very efficiently. Everybody across the world today looks at China as the model till COVID came, as that's the way to be able to go into development. What's your sense? Because today, in a democratic tradition, you have chaos. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or 3 steps backward, then you go forward, you come backward. What is something that we need for states to be able to enable its younger people or its innovators, etc., to create wealth in the new environment?
In terms of geopolitics, I was chairing a geopolitics event just last month for leaders from around the world. And there's no question about it. There's no more going to be a unipolar USA as the only superpower after the Cold War, where you had the USA and USSR. Now you've got China as a superpower. Then you may not like it, but that's the reality. But within 25 years, you're going to have a third superpower, and that's going to be India. It will, no question about it. 10 trillion, it's going to get to 30 trillion. India will be the third largest economy in the world, and that's a fact.
I mean, in 10 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
And also, tied with that is security. And this is where, how does India evolve in terms of its security alliances in this non-aligned way that it's grown so far? You know, we've got here in the West, we're part of NATO. We are part of other security alliances, the Five Eyes, AUKUS with Australia and America. India has finally joined Quad with the USA, Japan, Australia, and India. And I'm saying for a year now, the UK should join Quad to make it Quad Plus. So the more security alliances that India can get into with countries like the UK, along with FTAs and trade alliances, is going to be stronger and better. The UN needs to be drastically reformed. India is still not a permanent member of the Security Council. I mean, that can't be right. That has to change. G7, India is not a member of the G7. It is of the G20. And look at India being the presidency of the G20 this year. What an impact that is making within India and putting India on the global stage. So I'm absolutely confident of India's future trajectory. The point Naushad made is very important. There was a state, one of the senior ministers from Hyderabad, from Telangana, and one of the statistics that he gave a lot of statistics about the progress of Telangana and Hyderabad, but the one that stood out for me the most is the GDP per capita had increased significantly. And if you're in government, what's your most important objective is to make your citizens more prosperous. So if your GDP per capita goes up, that means what you're doing is working and making everyone better off, especially the people who are most poor. So that's what India's got to do, is continue to increase that productivity, increase that GDP per capita, which is going to happen.
How does that happen?
So you know, I want to come back to your China question, because, you know, if for anyone who's interested in development, I mean, you have to, and especially if you're interested in Indian development, you have to compare with China. It's the only country that has the same population, and it's the only country that India and China were more or less at the same place. 40 years ago, we had the same per capita GDP, more or less. Today, China is 5.5 times India's. So China has been phenomenally successful in growing much more rapidly than India has, amongst the most, actually in the last 40 years, the most rapidly growing country in the world. Right? And it's pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's been enormously successful. If you look at what China's done with innovation, if you go back again 40 years, India and China invested about the same percentage of GDP in R&D. Today, China invests, as a percentage of GDP, invests 3 times as much as India does. It invests about 2.2% or 2.4% now, I think, in R&D versus India's 0.7, which is still 0.7. If you look at where that investment takes place, again, very widespread in a whole set of new sectors, in alternate energy, etc., which is just way ahead of India. So all of these things are huge successes on China's part. Where China struggles is in its authoritarian nature. And if you mentioned COVID, the way in which China handled COVID initially, beyond not talking about it and letting the world know about it, but after that, handled it very well in terms of being able to control its spread. But later on, I mean, without question, everyone...
Even earlier this year when they shut down a whole city again.
That's right. I think even China recognizes that they handled it badly in the last year or two, very badly, and messed up China, messed up the world economy. And then if you look at the number of things that have been done of late, for example, with the tech entrepreneurs, a really successful tech sector, what do? They go after them. Because they want, as a government, to be able to control what the tech sector does. And look at what's happening. Look at what's happening, obviously, or has happened. Unfortunately, I have to use the past tense with Hong Kong. So these are the reflection of authoritarian rule, where one individual calls the shots on what should happen, and good can happen faster if they do the right thing. But if they choose and do the wrong thing, then there's no system that enables them to be thrown out. That's what I think is a great
Karan,
strength
look
for
at
India.
look at democracy. It's a messy business, right? You all voted for Brexit.
Well, Karan
Okay,
didn't.
let me ask, I ask this question regularly, okay? How many of you think that the UK leaving the European Union was a huge mistake. Can I just see a show of hands? There, please take a photograph. Somebody take a photograph of this. Yeah? I mean, I may have lost that battle, but I'll win the war. This is the biggest self-inflicted wound that any country can do to itself. Absolutely ridiculous. And I asked this question to that geopolitics. I had 100 leading CEOs and chief executives from around the world in that conference. And we finished a Brexit, pros and cons of Brexit, and I was chairing the next session on NATO. And I said, okay, before we start talking about NATO, I want to ask you the same. And I asked that question, 99 out of 100 hands went up. I've asked the question at a wealth management family office for people all over the world, the same thing happens.
But going back, democracy versus a strong state, because you had Brexit in a democracy.
So, by the way, and that is the whole question of how democratic was Brexit. We can go into a debate about referenda. And I think referenda are entirely undemocratic because the beauty of
democracy allows you to lie and get away with it, right?
No, it doesn't, because the beauty of democracy is that with the referendum, it's a one-off. We've had that result 7 years later. We have not been able to change it. With democracy, every 4 or 5 years, you have an election. If somebody lies to you, if you don't like the way, or they've let you down, you can vote somebody in. That's democracy.
But Democrats don't have a monopoly on lying. I mean, think of the number of dictators. I mean, what is Xi Jinping doing? I mean, and telling his people and so on. I mean, it's
or Putin in Russia.
Or Putin. I mean, I think really doing if you want to do really, really nasty things to the world, you need authoritarianism. I think Democrats get it wrong, but you need an out. When we get it wrong, then you need to be able to get rid of the people who've done it wrong. But I want to go further, which is that democracy we should remind ourselves, because we should definitely be very proud in India of our democratic traditions in terms of us being an electoral democracy, a democracy which delivers free elections, carries them out very effectively, and where changes in power, state and union level, happen in a very organized, respectful, productive way. That's as an electoral democracy. But there are things that go beyond that for true democratic underpinnings, which have to do with civil rights, which have to do with how minorities are treated, which have to do with everyone in society having a voice and equal say in the justice system, regardless of wealth, regardless of community, regardless of what part of the country they're in. There we have a lot of work to do. I think, in the UK, I was really impressed when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. Not because I somehow claim him as my own. I mean, Rishi Sunak is not Indian. I mean, we have to remind ourselves of that. He's not Indian. His origins are from various parts of East Africa, a little bit from Pakistan, and various parts, but it's less Indian. We can claim him,
except the Ganesh on the table.
Well, yeah. I mean, you can. All of those traditions are great, but I think the very fact that you have a prime minister who does not represent the mainstream is, I think, a very inspiring achievement. And I look forward to the day when the same thing will happen in India.
Well, in India, you've got double democracy because you've got your federal, state-level democracy, and the ruling government historically doesn't always rule a particular state. I mean, the whole of the south of India, if you go below Telangana and below, the BJP is not. So that's democracy as well. So I find India a very dynamic, healthy democracy. The elections are run in a far better way than our elections. You go into with a pencil and take.
And certainly better than the Americans are running there. I often say they need to outsource it to us to run their elections. But Karan, does business and does industry have a role, and in this case a responsibility, to ensure democratic traditions prevail?
Yes, and I think more and more now. So you used to get a state, you've gone through various phases where you want government as business to create the environment for business to succeed and entrepreneurship to flourish, and then get out of the way and let us get on with it. And there's a balance to that, because government has a huge role to be a catalyst, to be an enabler. many of the government initiatives that we have here are phenomenal. I give you many examples. I give you one quick one. One of Rishi's projects when he was Chancellor is called Help to Grow Management, where we provide mini MBAs for businesses, SMEs, that are run by business schools around the country to help them to grow more, which is fantastic. And it's 90% funded by the government, 10% by the business themselves. You can do that. That's a real help by government. But on the whole, you want to have the private sector to get on with it. But more and more now, private sector is seen to have its own responsibilities. And you have now what I call activist CEOs, activist chair people. I'm the ultimate. But earlier you should be apolitical. You shouldn't say anything if you're a chief executive chairman because you don't want to be controversial. Now you've got chairman, chief executives who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, willing for the company to do the right thing. And the whole tick box approach is gone. ESG, green. You can greenwash, you can ESG wash. But people now see through it very, very quickly. You've got to, as a company, actually live it, believe it, practice it. You say diversity and inclusion, you can tick that box. But do you actually have an inclusive environment in your company? Because diversity without inclusion is useless. So I think there's a much more responsible role now for business leaders.
Naushad, business leaders, responsible role, greenwash. It's not that the earth is at risk. It's humankind for the first time. And we had two scientists, a doctor and a scientist at JLF, Suneva Fushi, who gave humankind 150 years at the outside to last. And they said this will be the smallest, in the continuum of time, really the smallest amount of time that any race has marched towards extinction. What is the responsibility, again, for businesses as far as the environment goes? And how much is being done and what else needs to be done?
So, first, I think it's good to recognize that industry didn't start the environmental movement. The environmental movement was started actually by activists, going back to a time when they were a fringe, but they were a fringe which became more and more, I think, clear and widespread and dominant in their views. And those views started becoming mainstream and became then something that industry started to more systematically, first again a few industrialists started to more systematically engage with. And today, I think any company of any significance has a very positive, strong environmental program. I worry a little bit about ESG because it's so broad when you combine environment with social, with governance issues. We should worry about social issues and we should worry about governance issues, but we should see them as separate buckets, it seems to me, that we need to target. And then keep the focus on environment and keep the focus on what we need to do to become both to reduce our own carbon footprints, to reduce the carbon footprint more widely within industry, and then to also start impacting the wider carbon footprint of the world. Through the products that we come out with, through what we can actually do to reduce carbon in the environment. So I think we have more and more companies that are now very actively engaged. So for example, India has now a goal of being net zero by 2070. Many of us in industry feel that that goal is actually too far away. There are several Indian companies, large Indian companies, that have a goal of being net zero by 2030. Many more that are 2035. So well before the country is supposed to get there, you'll have different companies getting there. And that is the way it should be. You need to take that lead and play that role in a very significant and widespread way. My own argument is that the way to enable it is through carbon taxes. I'm a strong proponent of carbon taxes. We have a significant carbon tax in effect on oil prices in India. We have a much less significant one on coal prices. And if we bring in an effective carbon tax that is equalized across different fuel sources, it will actually enable much more rapid movement in the right direction for industry and for society more widely.
So if I just make on this point, when I was president of the Confederation of British Industry over here, the equivalent of CII, and I stepped down a year ago, but I was president during COP26 in Glasgow. And that is the first COP where business had a major presence. Otherwise, it was always government and NGOs, governments making commitments. We were the first country here, the UK, to legislate for net zero by 2050. countries started making those commitments, NGOs were there, but this was the first time business was there in a big way. And business is now making the commitments. I mean, you've mentioned, Naushad, companies making commitments. In the UK, over 2/3 of FTSE 100 companies have committed to net zero by 2050. 89% of companies have at least one climate-related goal without being legislated to do it. So companies are doing this on their own accord. And I think we should take heart in that, in that this is not something that we're dreaming of. It's actually happening as we speak now.
What do we need to do for packaging? Packaging today has become one of the biggest issues, and it's sort of really spoiling the oceans and everything around us. And because there's so much that's going through packaging, everybody is buying online as opposed to going to a store and then returning stuff as well. So you're having this double sort of act. What do we need to do?
I mean, we're taking huge steps over here in dealing with things like plastic. In my own industry, I mean, the circular economy is very important. And I always say making beer is one of the best examples of a circular economy, because the waste grain from the malt you make the beer is sent for cattle feed. The yeast that we use to make beer is used for Marmite. The carbon dioxide is captured and reused. The water that we use is treated and then reused as well. And on top of all that, the bottles that we have, the crushed glass, goes to make bottles again. So it's an absolute circular economy. Even more, I could go further. Now with Cobra Beer, we supply 7,000 restaurants. A huge proportion of those sales are through draft beer. So if you're doing draft beer using reusable aluminium kegs, and you're not using bottles or plastic or cans or so that's more environmental as well.
I think one of the ways is that you actually make companies responsible for the supply chain. And if you just make companies responsible for their own supply chains and for what happens with their products, and if they use whatever, you don't try to regulate what packaging material they use, just say that you have to find a way of dealing with it. And if you do that, automatically you'll find that the packaging material will come down very substantially in its footprint.
Naushad, you've been a great advocate of innovation and technology across, and you've also been a great advocate for equity and equality. What are those three things that we need to do in India to be able to drive technology and innovation amongst young, new innovators?
So the first is to increase the investment in R&D by companies in-house R&D. I mean, I don't want to bore everyone with, I'll give you just two numbers. First, we need to increase our investments in R&D and in-house R&D by a factor of 5, from 0.3% of GDP to the world average, which is 1.5%. So that's the first thing, because that drives and carries along with it a whole lot of innovation within industry. And that innovation done in industry then creates a demand on the output of technology or science from, say, universities. So the second bit is what we talked about earlier on, about doing public research within the higher education system. And that's the second number. We need to go from 0.05% of GDP done within the higher education sector to 0.4%, which is the world average. So about 8 times more within the higher education sector. That's the second big piece. And then third, we need to actually use our very strong entrepreneurial system and really encourage startups. We've been very successful doing it, but a lot of startups find that once they get beyond a certain size, they find it more attractive to relocate to Singapore, say. And I think we need to say, listen, what is it that's doing that? And how do we ensure that the environment for them to stay in India, to engage with the UK, to engage with other countries, engage with Singapore, but stay in India and actually grow and thrive in India. I think there's still work to be done.
So may I ask your permission, please, Sanjoy, if I may? Can I ask the audience a question?
We'll come to the audience. I'm
asking them a question.
We'll open it up to the audience right now. Yeah, you ask, but I just...
To make this point.
Okay, go ahead.
There's no right or wrong answer. Can you put your hands up if you think you're creative? If you think you're not creative, there's no right or wrong. Please be honest with yourselves and me. Keep your hands down if you think you're not creative. If you think you're creative, put your hands up. Can I just see? Okay, this is exceptional, by the way, and I think it's because of where we are and the Jaipur Literary Festival. So normally, when I ask this question around the world, half the hands go up and half the hands stay down. And the reality is that, how many of you know that there is on the 21st of April, is UN Innovation and Creativity Day. How many of you know that fact? Very few, yeah? If we could get our children to be more creative from a very young age, to unleash that creative spirit, that is the key, to have creativity. When I became an entrepreneur, I thought I was not creative. I was useless at art. I couldn't play the piano pretty well. I was told you're useless at art, you're not creative. I am very creative, and I only discovered that when I became an entrepreneur. So if we can unleash that creative spirit is point number one. Point number two, innovation. Naushad is spot on. We in the UK only spend 1.7% of GDP on innovation. America spends 3.1%. Germany spends 3.2%. I've just come back from Israel. They're off the charts. They're at 5%. Yeah. So if we spent more per capita on R&D and innovation, that would be so powerful. And yet this country, in spite of that, which university in the world has more Nobel Prizes than any other? It's not Harvard or Princeton or Caltech. It's Cambridge University. One college in Cambridge, Trinity College, has more than 30 Nobel Prizes. Birmingham University has over 10 Nobel Prizes. So we're a very innovative country, but if we invested more, we'd be even more innovative, and that's the key to it.
I'm going to open it up and then I'll come back. So questions, and we'll take them in clusters. We'll take 3 at a time. So 1, 2, and there was one at the back. So let's start from here.
Thank you all for a very, very interesting discussion. My specific question is for Karan. On the subject of creativity, I would just like to draw the attention of everyone here to the work of the great Rabindranath Tagore, so that during the British Raj, when the British approach to education of Indians was just to have good little foot soldiers educated to a certain level to serve the requirements of the Raj, whereas the great Rabindranath Tagore, he was developing the creativity of children, teaching them in nature all the time with reference back to nature's laws. So if being taught mathematics, if the rain comes down...
The question, let's get to the question.
The question is, do you see relevance for UK to draw on this? Because I'm appalled by what I know of the education system here and the products coming out of it.
Thanks. So hold that question, the second one here.
Thank you. Very interesting debate. I'm glad you touched on ESG, sustainability, circularity. I would love to be in the mirror with you debating it because I don't agree with a lot of what you said. But that aside, 4 weeks ago, China announced a new investment in creating the Centre of Excellence for Blockchain in Beijing. Not for crypto, remember, crypto is banned in China, as it is in India, but to ensure data is collected from supply chains for their companies. So they form an export kite mark with evidence and substantiated data held in a blockchain to ensure that they are at the next level of export capability. When's India going to do that?
And the third question at the back.
Is it surprising that businesses go to Singapore rather than India because of the diabolical and pathetic rules of law, commercial law, and the shenanigans that go on there?
So that's 3 questions. Blockchain, Tagore and its relevance, diabolical complications.
Okay, so let me very briefly, by the way, you asked Karan the question, but I think the Indian higher education system could benefit from greater study of what Tagore did at Vishwa Bharati and how he brought together different fields and the style of teaching. It was a very teacher-intensive style of teaching because the class sizes were very small. But there's lots for us that we can really use very effectively in our own wider system. And I think the very name Vishwa Bharati is itself, I think, quite powerful because it was both meant as India looking out and learning from the best in the world, while at the same time trying to take that best and take it further through work within the country. So I think lots for us to learn from Tagore in India as well. Should I go to the diabolical question? I mean, and the block. I mean, when is India going to do it? I have no idea. I'm not even sure. The only thing I would say is the Indian government has been pretty good about actually developing platforms. And when these platforms, such as the payment platform, has been an extremely effective, successful platform, which is now then built on by a whole bunch of private providers that have devised their own payment systems, riding on the wider government payments, the payment platform. And it's now led to India leading the world in electronic payments. I think we currently account for 40% of all electronic payments each day, from a standing start 5 years ago. So it's been a very dramatic effect. And the only thing I would suggest is that a similar approach for, say, something like blockchain would be very effective, where the government plays a role of facilitating a platform which then private enterprise can build on and devise their own systems, whether it's for the movement of goods and logistics or whether it's for any other transaction within industry. That's the only thing I can suggest, but maybe Karan can answer your question more specifically. On the legal system and so on, you know, the British economist Joan Robinson, who was a great scholar of India, has one of my favorite quotes on India, where she said, by the way, she was speaking to her student, Amartya Sen, and she said, you know, whatever can be said about India, so can the opposite, or the opposite is always also true. And just as we have very many challenges with the legal system, with huge pendency of cases in our court system, you know, across levels of the courts, we also have at times an ability for the system to kind of cleanse itself. So just when you worry about the system being much less independent than you would like it to be, you will have a judgment or an announcement that runs entirely counter to that and displays great independence and a move forward. So I think, you know, India always has to be seen in its full richness. And you will see things that really are problematic, that need to be fixed, but you will also see things that are positive and good and powerful that one needs to build off. You know,
so Naushad, what you're saying is the balance will return.
The balance will return. The balance will return. It's sort of messy and clogged, but we have to work our way through it and make it better.
He respectfully disagrees. It's okay, we've got that. Karan, you were going to respond.
So just Rabindranath Tagore, I mean, there are very few people actually at any one time who are true polymaths, and he was the most incredible polymath. I mean, not many people know he was a brilliant artist as well as being an author and a poet, and it was absolutely phenomenal. But the whole thing about the creativity and innovation is one definition of innovation is coming up with solutions to problems. And I found when I was president of CBI, dealing with the worst global crisis since the Second World War, with the pandemic and then the sad war in Ukraine, it was this entrepreneurial background of mine, which was always seeing a problem and then seeing a solution and then wanting to act quickly. We would see the problem before government even saw the problem. We would see the solution before government even saw the problem. So that advantage, and I call it, there's a different mindset. The big civil service, big company, bureaucratic mindset, I call playing not to win. You'll find any reason not to do it, to play it safe. The entrepreneurial mindset, the innovative mindset is playing to win. And it's a completely different frame of mind and attitude, and when it's effective, it's very effective. A point that I didn't bring up, with India and the UK working together and linked to your blockchain, at Birmingham, I led a delegation in February at Birmingham University. We have just announced the first joint degree between the University of Birmingham and IIT Madras. 1.5 years master's in AI and data science. And the students spend time in India and Birmingham and Birmingham Madras. I mean, that is the future. Can you imagine the power of that? Is going to be absolutely phenomenal. With blockchain, of course, when it comes to technology. Now, AI, that hasn't come up yet in this discussion. But, you know, this whole debate about AI, oh my God, it's going to be so dangerous. But what an enabler it's going to be. And India, I think, has shown the world with the Aadhaar card, what it's done with the Aadhaar card, that has empowered so many people. Now, you can have a debate about privacy and data, but it's worked. It's actually helped so many people. There's a big debate that we should have identity cards in this country that would help so much. And that what that platform that Naushad spoke about enables the whole country to deliver. And in terms of telephone technology, India has leapfrogged. Financial payments, India is way ahead of what we are over here in the UK. And finally, I'm sorry to say this, we should also give credit where it's due. India is one of the top 4 or 5 countries in the world generating unicorns. And one of the biggest things that India's liberalization did was that closed, inward-looking, insular economy, the entrepreneurial spirit of India was unleashed. And that has really taken off now. And there are many, many companies that are growing within India for the Indian market, for the consumer market India's growing. And I have huge faith that entrepreneurial spirit is one of the most powerful in the whole world.
This side, yeah. You at the back, both, yeah, start here. Start with the gentleman.
Thank you. It's a fascinating discussion. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Naushad. I've just got that. You may address this point that I'm making. There's Indians, in America, you look at head of Pepsi, you look at what's happening in the UK. I disagree. I think Rishi's pretty Indian, lighting Diaz outside number 10 and all that. We've achieved so much outside of India. Are there any stats on the brain drain? I mean, anyone that seems to get anywhere I could be wrong, but they seem to want to send their kids abroad and they don't go back. I'm a sandwich generation. My parents came here 60 years ago, and we had a board meeting yesterday, and we were all saying all our kids should actually be moving to Mumbai. The opportunities are huge. Immediately, the 4 of us just winced and said, gosh, exactly what that gentleman was saying. Do we really want to put them through that? So...
Okay. At the back? Come to you.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I want to ask you, Karan, you touched on healthcare, you also touched on diversity and inclusion. So I am a creative artist and a doctor, and have been leading in diversity in my field. But there's a real problem in the National Health Service. 75% of doctors reported racism last year. 1 in 5 are leaving due to racism. There is lack of representation at the top in the National Health Service of ethnic minority groups. How can you bring your matrix of success to the National Health Service and make change so we're both inclusive as well as diverse?
And the last question from here. Front.
I thought you
We'll
had
take
to,
3 questions and I'll...
you had to struggle to find a white doctor in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many of the advice that we've given today have been given in the past as well. And so my question really is, why is it that we don't take this advice in India? In particular, my question is about the bureaucracy, which because of the incentives it faces within the system is, to use his words, plays not to win. So without a reform of civil service, it's very hard to imagine many of these changes actually happening. So do you have any advice on how to do it?
So bureaucracy, Karan, for you, the NHS, what can you do? And of course, then the thing of the sandwich generation, the new generation going back with some trepidation.
Sure. So let me start with this one and then go to the other one, because I think that's a better one to end on. In terms of when I read books about India and sort of what needs to be done, the bit that always worries me is that a key limitation in India is actually state capacity. We have a great ability to formulate policy, but we have limited ability to carry it out at the end level. And that has a lot to do with the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic incentives, especially at lower levels, and so on. Right? And this is not a political point. It was true of the previous government, it's true of the current government, it was true of the government before that. Yeah? So it's that state capacity that limited state capacity is simply a fact. And I think that's why we need to devise policies that take that into account and that do not draw that much on state capacity. So I'm not trying, when I talk about what we need to do, I'm not saying wave a magic wand and suddenly have this greatly competent bureaucracy, have all of this tremendous foresight and decision making, etc. I'm making the argument that the state should do fewer things. By doing fewer things that only the state can do, and these are really important, it should do them better. And then it should leave everything else for private enterprise, private NGOs to play a much bigger role than they currently do. Right? So that's the approach that I'm taking. I think that, and I really would advocate that when we think about India, we should not think about India as being a country that will be solved through wiser, better, bigger government. We should think about India as a country that will progress more rapidly if government plays the role that it must and only it can do and focuses on those things. Private enterprise plays a much bigger role, including a social role, than it does now, and an innovation role more than it does now. And NGOs are also fostered and encouraged to actually play a bigger role than they do now. So that's the way for us, it seems to me, to progress. Yeah? On the, why go to India question, I mean, there's a very simple answer. And I'll give you the answer that was my personal answer. I used to, one time, many, many years ago, I used to teach a course in the US. And people used to ask me, which do you enjoy more? Teaching in the US or working in India? And I used to always say, look, I really enjoy the course. I love the students. They're really bright, etc. Yeah? But I also used to say that I was very clear that if I used to teach at Stanford, and if Stanford had never heard of me, it would be no worse a university. Because, I mean, I hardly made a difference to the place. And maybe it was my ego speaking, but I felt that I made more of a difference in India. There's just the very fact that you have a limited state capacity means that there is much greater opportunity to contribute all around you in whichever field. In the development of people, in schools, in ensuring that people have a better livelihood, you can have a much more enriching, satisfying life, it seems to me, in a country that's at our stage of development. This is not Indian culture or anything like that. It's simply, there's more to do. We have so much space and available opportunity to contribute. That's why one should come to India. It's not for any other reason. And it may mean that you end up living in more cramped quarters, but you'll probably make great friends and you probably have a wonderful time. So you should encourage your kids to come to India.
And you'll get great food.
Yeah, you would. Yeah, you would. Yeah.
Absolutely. But one of the favorite courses that I teach is to the Cambridge MBA students, and it's a 3-hour negotiations masterclass using Brexit as a case study. How not to do it. So the Indian brain drain, I look at it the other way. When I came to study here, I'm the third generation, my family, to be educated here. Oh, you're leaving the mother country, brain drain. Well, all my family went back. I'm the only one who stayed on because I came up with this idea for Cobra Beer and I put it into action. But now India's taken a different mindset that the 30 million people of Indian origin who live around the world are a huge asset to India. They are, as Prime Minister Modi says, the living bridge between our countries where we live and India, and it's very powerful. I feel in a privileged position to be equally at home in both countries and to try and put the two countries together. And India is now proud of, somebody made the point, I mean, Indians are now leading the biggest companies in the world. Day by day you get, or the World Bank, or a Prime Minister here, or the Portuguese Prime Minister, or the Irish Prime Minister. I mean, it is non-stop. Nikki Haley is standing for president. It is phenomenal what the Indians are achieving around the world, and we should all be proud of that. The more that Indians can do back home, all the better. The point about inclusivity and diversity in the NHS, well, there is a huge shortage of doctors and nurses. And that shortage is filled in a big way by Indian doctors and nurses, and there is more and more of a demand. What I can say, to answer your question, is this country's made a big difference in terms of diversity and inclusion, people reaching the very top. In Parliament, I'll give you a quick example. When I was in Cambridge in the 1980s, big excitement in 1987, first 4 ethnic minority MPs elected to the House of Commons since the Second World War. And those of you old enough would remember Keith Vaz, Bernie Grant, Paul Boateng, Diane Abbott, first 4. And there was one in the House of Lords, Lord Chitness, who was at Birmingham University with my mother. So 5 ethnic minority parliamentarians. 25 years later, I was in Parliament then myself. We took a picture of all the ethnic minority parliamentarians in House of Lords, House of Commons, 69 of us in Westminster Hall on the steps. Fast forward to 2019, after Boris Johnson's victory in December 2019, we had another photograph, 100 of us on the steps. So from 5 in 1987 to 100 in 2019. But you do the sums, 100 out of the number of House of Lords, the number of House of Commons is not even half the proportion of the population of ethnic minorities. So we're only halfway there, but we have a Prime Minister and several cabinet ministers. And finally, about the bureaucracy. We complain about bureaucracy in this country. People complain about bureaucracy in every country. My most important point is this. Any bureaucracy, any civil service Number one is they should be utterly professional and utterly apolitical and should never get involved in politics. And they're there to serve the government of the day, whatever party they come from, whether they like them or not. And even more importantly, linked to that, one of India's great strengths is India's armed forces have never got involved in politics. And long may that continue.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I would have loved to ask Karan and Naushad Forbes about empathy. And should empathy be the one factor that every CEO must look at when making a decision? Sadly, we'll have to leave it for another time. Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Karan Bilimoria, Naushad Forbes. They'll be both signing their books at the book signing place, so go and pick up a copy of The Struggle and the Promise. Thank you.